Good. All right.
Are you doing that willingly? All right.
Number 2 today. Hey, how's it going, guys? You made it to the last talk at Derbycon. Congratulations. You should get like a challenge coin or something like that. So, talk is called changeme, a better tool for hunting default creds. And basically, the whole genesis of this is we got asked a pretty seemingly simple question. Hey, go find all the default creds in an environment, right? And having been a pen tester for years and using different tools to scan for things, I knew there were gaps. And so we scanned for things, and we didn't find a whole lot, which is sort of scary, knowing how big the environment is. And so we said, okay, let's maybe do something else, right? And so what am I really talking about is not so much the like SSH brute force or any sort of like brute forcing of protocols. It's more about actual default credentials for web interfaces. And so pretty much all the software that you install on your network probably has a management interface that you log in to do the administration of it. And the problem is it's all written in HTTP, which that protocol really is just to visualize, all the data, and every interface is implemented differently, right? Some examples are like Tomcat and JBoss. Between those two, to log in Tomcat is actually HTTP authorization header, and JBoss is a web UI. So just in those two examples, right, we have vastly different ways of trying to log in and detect these credentials here. And so the problem is that they're all different, they're all beautiful, but they're all different, right? And it makes it a little bit of a challenge to try to like scale this out. So when we started doing that test and looking for those credentials across the environment, we used some Metasploit modules to try to detect that and sort of verify some of the results that we're getting back. We actually found bugs in Metasploit module, so I think it was back in 2015. We fixed that, so we fixed the JBoss issue there, but also realized that doesn't scale because that's like 60 lines of code in Ruby every time you want to implement a new module for checking for stuff, and it doesn't really scale. So when we started doing some of our research, and this is just very high level, give you some idea of how quickly this tails off. We've also tested the other product that's not up here, but because we're not officially licensed for it, I wouldn't publish the results. But they're really good at finding the really common stuff. So Apache and Tomcat. But immediately, once you start getting past that really well-known stuff, it starts to tail off very quickly. So Qualys doesn't find WebSphere. We report it to them. Someday maybe they'll check for it. I don't know. But then you start talking about things like IBM Netezza. Has everybody heard of that? Like very big data, probably contains lots of interesting things. Runs FPGAs, very cool architectures, and lots of sensitive data. And nobody checks for default creds on that, and it's everywhere in a lot of really big enterprises. HP Server Automation, runs your servers. It can log in, administer them, install patches, basically do anything on them, and nobody checks for default creds on that bad boy. So sensitive stuff, if somebody finds this, like an attacker, obviously they can do some really bad stuff with it. And then the really scary thing we started finding is, we're working on newer technologies. So a lot of the DevOps type technologies, basically, they don't find any of them. And the most frustrating thing for me is that we see down here at the bottom, this is some Nessus output, that they actually detect that the service is there, but they don't try to log in to see if it has default credentials. They're like, hey, great, it's there. All right, take another maybe hour to write that check so that you're actually securing things. So that's sort of the scary thing to me is, these are all informational, right? Elasticsearch databases are giant databases full of juicy information. Sonatype, if you haven't heard of that, that's basically a lot of your source code is all in there. So it's a quality management tool for source code. And Memcache is in memory cache, and a lot of times it's used to store serialized objects, and there is no auth on that. So it's just scary to see that like these tools are scanning stuff, and even if they do detect them, they're probably not trying the default credentials for them. So how do we try to initially solve this? Basically, intern-powered scanner. Austin was here earlier. He had to go home. But we basically scanned everything within Nmap, piped it through Eyewitness, and slowly chugged through that. It took a while, but it was really effective. And we found dozens of credentials and some of the things that we were talking about, like the Netezza and the HP Server Automation. This was slow, and this sucked. And so we thought there's got to be a little bit better way to do it. So of course, write code, right? That solves all the world's problems. So it started off really simple using like the Python request library. Makes it really straightforward to make some requests. And one of the things I want to do is actually store all the credentials in YAML files to get away from the issue with like Metasploit, where you write everything in code. I want to sort of separate the credential piece from the code. So the general principles are that it separates that code, makes them human readable, makes it easily editable, so that I can go and see what that looks like. Good luck trying to go to the commercial scanners and seeing what exactly that they're doing there. A lot of it's obfuscated. Makes it very difficult to know what are you actually checking for. And it's really focused on default credentials, not common credentials. So it's not a brute force scanner, right? There's plenty of those out there. Hydra, Nessus, Nessus can do it too. But what's that? Medusa, yes. Up too late last night. Also losing my voice. So, really focus on the default one. So like those web interfaces, that's the primary focus of it, because there's such a gap, right? There's plenty of brute forcers out there that can do that. And one of the things I'm interested in is sort of, as I'm adding new protocols, the provenance of those credentials. Like, as you see, like lots of lists have out there, like SNMP, and they have like 160 different default SNMP credentials. I don't know where those came from or what they go to. Like, I'm interested in finding that out. And for the project, it's heavily unit tested. Still means I break stuff, but means that I know when I broke stuff. So how does this work? Basically, there's a couple phases here. It starts out when it builds targets. So it's going to take in a number of different formats. It's going to figure out, okay, this is what I want to scan, and then does a fingerprinting phase, and then does a scan phase, and then obviously reporting stuff out. So let's just do some demos here. Because I'm lazy, and we're running low on time, I'm just going to copy stuff. So the most basic thing you do is basically just feed a IP address to changeme, and it will just start scanning stuff. In this case, it's going to take a little bit, but we're going to find here, maybe it looks a little better if I shrink it down just a bit. You guys still see that? All right, cool. So basically, I've got a bunch of different services run locally on my box, and very quickly scanned and found a whole bunch of default credentials. So that's the most simple use case of it. Obviously, there wasn't a whole lot of output. If you start scanning large ranges, you might be curious, like, what the hell is this thing doing? There's different, essentially debug levels that you can start getting more and more information out of it. Starts telling you, informational that, let's scroll back up here, that it's matching these headers. So even if it doesn't find default credentials, it might be useful for just fingerprinting stuff in an environment. And then there's obviously the debug flag, which is basically vomit mode, where it just dumps everything out, and this is how we debug why it's not working. All right. So it supports a number of different protocols. The original focus was on those HTTP web interfaces, but I've added in more protocols since then. There's quite a few out of them, and generally the syntax, you probably can't see that. So one of the ways you can put syntax in there to specify a specific protocol you want to target is using this, where it's the protocol name, whack whack, and then the actual IP address. So we can target a MongoDB server here specifically, and it will scan just for MongoDB, and it's not going to scan for anything else. And I still see I have a bug there for that. So you see we found our MongoDB, and that's all we scan for. So we can specify more succinctly too what we want to scan for. So by default, it's going to look for all credentials for all protocols that you have enabled, which may be too much. You may want to focus that on, say, like Tomcat. So if we scan our server for Tomcat credentials, we'll see here that, hey, my found queue keeps not getting cleared. So we found a new bug. And as I mentioned in what we released for changeme 1.0 is that there's going to be new bugs. End up being about, looks like 1,400 new lines of code cut out. 360, so about 1,100 lines of new code to get out there. So we're seeing a little bit of a bug here, but no big deal. So one of the things that we should have noticed, but it's hard to see because of the way the credentials are coming out here with extra credentials, is that we didn't detect Tomcat. So one of the problems is that by default it just checks on the default port. It won't check on other ports for it. But there's a new feature that, or at least in version 1.0, that basically allows you to override that. This is called the port override feature. So this is one that like a number of people were interested in. I had a couple of issues on GitHub about it. But basically what you can do is specify a port onto that IP address and then give it the port override protocol, or switch I should say. And so now if we watch, we should see that first we detect the Tomcat. Go up here, we can see that, hey, now we actually saw that it's there. And we go back up. We can see that it actually found Tomcat. So able to modify that. And so I've been showing like a lot of stuff, passing it directly in with a single argument. All the different variations on like how you can set hosts up and different protocols and things like that. You can feed in via text file. You can also feed it in an nmap XML file, and I'll install that final positional argument. So let's see here. So what we're going to do is actually pass it setter notation. So it's going to try to scan that whole subnet. And this one might not work, but we'll give it a second. I guess any questions so far? Yeah.
So you mentioned when you started this, you were using like Nessus as your feeder for identifying protocols and services. Have you put any thought into taking in an input file and things like that from like a Nessus scan where it does service detection but not credential detection?
I hadn't, but that's interesting. No, so it'll take in nmap XML file.
Oh, well, okay.
Yep. So like I was saying, that positional argument here. I'll just kill that. Pop back up here. So, kind of alluding to it a little bit, basically that positional argument, you can pass sort of whatever, and it'll figure out what you passed it. It tries to parse it as like an nmap XML if it's a file, and if it's not, it thinks it's just a flat text file, and I'll try just to load them in for you. No, I mean if there's other use cases, feel free to make a pull or an issue on GitHub, and I'll see what I can do. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so we can dive into the deep end, I guess, if we want to look at some code. So one of the things I did back in like March was a fairly major rewrite of like the underpinnings of this, because like I said, this grew organically, right? It was like 50 lines of code, and then it was like a couple hundred lines of code, and then it was like a couple hundred more lines of code, and then it got just unwieldy. So what I ended up doing was breaking it out and making a lot of inheritance and modular pieces to it. So if you're talking about scanners, the scanners are based off of the aptly named scanner.py. And so this is like the parent class of all these. So if you go, and this has got a fair amount of stuff in it. And the nice thing is, if you want to go and implement a new protocol, implementing the protocol itself, let's see if I can full screen this. Like this is it for code for SSH. Like super small. So it's not that hard to extend that and to make it do all these other protocols. It basically ends up inheriting from the scanner class, which then gets you all the methods that you need to actually basically do the scans and the checks and the things like that. And all you have to do is override a couple of methods to make it go. So generally, there's the private method _check, which is that the custom check to actually do whatever the thing is that you want to do in the scanner. And then there's also a helper make scanner function that just basically returns a object of the current class. Yeah.
You've been able to put a lot of IoT rules in here.
What kind of rules? IoT? So I haven't had a chance to put any IoT type rules in there. That would be of interest. So one of the things, we keep jumping around a little bit in my slide deck, but one of the things I'm sort of asking for here is like, hey, if you find this cool, please help out. Like, I obviously can't go out and buy like just tons and tons of like IoT devices. My wife would kill me. But I guess to answer, Caleb's other question, like how easy is it to extend it? Since we're running low on time, I'll show you how to make one. So there's a switch in here. You probably can't see that. And it's called make cred. And so basically, it's just going to ask you a whole bunch of questions, right? And the idea is that it's going to generate this YAML file for you. So you don't have to manually know the format of it. You don't have to worry about that. That's sort of my deal, right? I just want to make this easy for you. I want to make it easy to actually extend this stuff. Because again, part of the problem with like the Metasploit approach that we were initially using was it's like 56 lines of code and like it's very brittle and just slow and it kind of sucks. So just put our Derbycon, yeah, stack trace. Promise this works before, right? Swore this worked like 15 minutes ago. Yeah, right. So I got another bug to fix. So, like I said, I introduced probably a lot more bugs into it. But in theory, probably if I revert it, I could get a working copy. But it basically just asks you a whole bunch of different questions. And what you'll have to end up doing, and I guess we can sudo walk through it. So, especially for the web ones, I'll use like Burp Suite to kind of see things. So it's going to ask you like, you know, how do I fingerprint this page? And so, like if we have Grafana here, and go and look, we should see. This is super hard because it's so big. We can look in the response and we probably find something that's like title Grafana. So when you're walking through it, I'll basically say, okay, hey, is there something in the body of this thing that I can use as a fingerprint? This will be like your fingerprint. And then it'll slowly walk through and ask you more questions about it. And then ultimately it kicks out the YAML file. So the YAML files, so the YAML files end up looking something like this. So we talked a little bit about like the protocol. It'll ask you if it's running SSL or not. Here's the, you can name it whatever you want to name it. There's a fingerprint section, which we kind of just talked about the fingerprint. So it might be a title, it might be some sort of response code. It could be like in Apache Tomcat instance, like the actual domain that's coming back as, and what URL that you want to go to. It also has, the actual credentials themselves, and there's a couple different types of credentials. There's regular form post, there's get, there's basic auth, and then this one in particular is raw, which basically means just here's the raw string, dump this into like a post payload. We found some really goofy web interfaces. Like IBM's got some crazy stuff that just makes no sense on how it works. Like cannot web server, I guess. I don't know. Like it's really goofy. So we ended up creating some weird stuff like this. And so I guess to your question about IoT stuff, like we've done some printers. Like there's some printer stuff in here, and that probably drove the most goofy code that we have, like to actually make this run. Because it's just weird stuff. Weird stuff. Cool. So we did demos. So I'll post the slides online if you guys want to go and play with it. I'll also fix broken code. So general how to get it. So it was pushed up to GitHub. And I guess funny story. I'm sitting here in Derby yesterday, waiting in line to get a Starbucks coffee, and I'm sitting there reading, and it says, "Hey, it's never too late to write code and get your stuff into Kali." I'm like, "Oh, that's cool. Let's see what's in the latest release of Kali." And start reading. I'm like, "Sweet, it's got like Bloodhound." And then I'm like, "Oh, what the hell?" Like, I guess it's in Kali now. So obviously not the latest version. Yeah, thanks. I'll work to get the latest version up and running. Yeah, and it's been out there for a couple months, and I guess nobody ever pinged me about it. So it's been out there since Kali rolling in like July, mid-July. So That's a little bit older version. I recommend pulling down the latest version. So how to get it? Basically, GitHub is the best way to go. Docker's a pretty nice way of pulling it as well. So every time I push a tagged release out, it'll create automatically a new Docker container for it. So you should be able to pull down the latest Docker, which will get you the latest credentials to scan for. One thing that we'll be doing fairly quickly is putting together a Docker Compose file, because it's now one of the big changes in this version is now uses Redis as a backend, and it's way faster. So a little bit notes about performance. It does fall back to using a SQLite database on disk, which gets slow and has disk contention if you start to have too many threads. With this, with the new Redis version, we ran a scan last week that had 50 threads and scanned about 15,000 nodes in an hour and a half. So it's much faster, much more performant. So do Redis if you can. Like, it will fall back to SQLite, but will probably break and not work very well, to be honest. Yeah, huge thanks to all contributors that we've had. Surprisingly, there's quite a few folks that have given back to the project or given constructive ideas. The whole idea for, making an interface to make the files was a gentleman in the audience here, Matt. So a lot of good feedback from folks already on the project, and definitely welcome to any feedback you guys have. So where I want to take this, basically, I spent a lot of time sort of making it work somewhat well. Obviously, there's some bugs we still got to fix out, but I just want to start feeding this with a whole bunch more creds. So whether that's IoT stuff that you're interested in, there's ways to set categories, so you can specify I only want to scan like printers, like that's an option in there. You can scan just different categories of that way. So if you're interested in just like IoT type stuff and you want to tag your stuff as IoT, you can do that, and it will scan just that type of stuff. So you can make it more focused. And yeah, like I mentioned before, the some of the provenance stuff that I want to do. So I want to start to track down where some of these credentials came from and sort of document them to a degree, as well as also creating that Docker Compose file. So make it a little bit easier to launch and deploy. So that's it. Thank you. Appreciate it. I think we're a little bit over in time, but any questions, or if not, I'll be around. Yeah. Good question. So the question was, how are you handling devices that had multiple defaults? So, if we look here, basically, this is just a list in the credential file. Actually, let's open up. General Tomcat, because it's Apache Tomcat. So kind of like this. So basically, it's it will go through the make cred switch will go through and ask you like how many default credentials do you want to add, and then you just keep adding them in, and it'll put them into this format. And so when it goes and detects that interface, it will then try all the credentials that you give it. So this example of one of those lists, I'm like, where did some of these come from? Obviously, QLogic comes from QLogic, but for some of these other ones, like, we don't know where they came from. But yeah, it'll handle multiple credentials for. Yeah, but just for known defaults. Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, thanks, guys.